we're a bit skeptical whether they've got the tactics to achieve a rapid breakout. So what they are doing, this incremental advance, is not well suited to a sudden transition to a huge breakout that would seize, tens and tens of kilometers. But what they are doing across the Donbass is putting pressure along the front line, and it's worth sort of talking a little bit of detail about how that works. But the the challenge for both sides is rapid breakthrough and then breakout, and that doesn't seem to be likely. I mean, I'm not saying it's not impossible, but the tactics that are being used just don't um, align with that kind of large advance for large numbers of people. There's been a problem of coordination. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive struggled to coordinate tens of thousands of people and became quite small assaults of several hundred. And the Russian tactics haven't even achieved that level of coordination. And to a degree, they're not trying to do that. I mean, they haven't really trained lots of these people to do that. It is using their raw materials in a way that they think achieves their objectives. When I talked about pressure across the front line, we're talking along this sort of section in and around Donbass. So Touretsk, if that goes, you could look kind of northish towards Konstantinivka. Pokrovsk opens up more land behind it. I think Chaziv Yar is the area that will be of particular concern because that is on higher ground. And what lies beyond that is a lot of much lower ground. It's much flatter. So if you take Chaziv Yar, you can look south-ish towards Konstantinivka. But actually what happens is that Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, reasonably large towns and cities, are under threat. Russian artillery could probably start hitting them even more extensively. You have the commanding higher ground, but also once you're beyond that, there's not a huge, extensive defensive prepared line. And so there's the danger that the Russians wouldn't launch themselves 20 or 30 kilometers all of a sudden, but the Ukrainians might be compelled to pull quite a long way back to try and prepare more positions, essentially trade the space for buying themselves some more time. I think the problem is that means giving up territory. I mean, this is emotionally hard. These cities are being pulverized and the civilian population is leaving. Pokrovsk, though, is a big transport hub. It's a big supply route for the area. If it falls, you can look in multiple directions a lot more easily along the roads, and it is being squeezed. So there are both tactical disadvantages to losing some of these areas, but we are also talking about the displacement of civilians and the loss of ground that they might fear they won't get back.
And as part of this, Russia has more recently renewed its attack on the city of Pokrovsk. They've been targeting this city ostensibly since July 2024 now. Why have they not managed to capture that city yet?
I mean, that's a fair question. And I think, when we looked back at this in the autumn last year, given how close they had got, and that was, I think, about 8 or 9 kilometers from the outskirts, it looked like Pokrovsk might have fallen by Christmas, and it hasn't. And now what the Russians are doing are trying to envelop it, if you like, from the south. And that seems to be partly as a result of fierce Ukrainian defense, and partly because they've sort of slightly changed their tactics. What this all shows is defense is still strong in this war. It's not completely static, but attack is really hard because as you get closer to the front, the pervasiveness of surveillance, including from drones, and the difficulty of breaking through prepared defenses means that it's incredibly bloody and difficult to advance. And that's proved almost as true for the Russians as it has for the Ukrainians. What the Russian tactics are about is repeated, quite small scale, quite messy attacks, often involving just troops dismounted, often not involving lots of armor, and they all get killed. But then they attack again and again and again and from multiple angles. And what that does is just wear down the Ukrainian defenders. They can't be pulled off that front line. They can't rest. They're constantly under pressure. Small and potentially understaffed units are having to defend large areas, and essentially they get eventually tired or overwhelmed. But that means the rate of advance is slow. And so when we talked about it accelerating, what we mean is it went from tens of meters a day to hundreds of meters a day, but still not lightning fast advances that we saw very, very early on in 2022 in both directions.
And at this point, is that looking likely that Pokrovsk will fall?
I this is genuinely difficult to know, and I'm always wary of trying to second guess the front line from 1,000 miles away, and that's because we we might have expected it to fall before now, and the fact that the Russians are sort of sidling almost around it, um, means it might survive for a bit longer, actually, but it's beginning to form or look like it's forming a pocket, and you could get increasingly exposed if, or the Ukrainians could, if they are stuck defending that pocket because of the supply line importance. The thing is that it is slowly being reduced to rubble. So they're now fighting over a semi-destroyed city, which seems to have lost a significant proportion of its population. Because in range of Russian artillery, they're probably only 2 kilometers away at the closest point, and they will have a difficult decision about the balance of holding on, protecting the transport links, or falling back and consolidating. And this mirrors some of the debate about whether or not to defend places like Bakhmut, which was controversial and is still the source of some debate.
And outside of the Pokrovsk sort of area, are there other key objectives that the Russians have in eastern Ukraine?
I think there are relatively few people talk about strategic targets, and I've made this comment elsewhere this week that I think that term is misused because that's really strategic targets are things that you launched a war to achieve your goals. Um, and what we're talking about here is these are targets that are tactical in nature. They are local. They're the next target on the list. So if Pokrovsk falls, that's not the end of the war. But the accumulation of this territory and the aggregate effect of losing a number of towns and settlements is all deeply harmful for the cause. I think, the Russians would like to be advancing more in the south around Zaporizhia. They're not really doing much there. They really wanted to threaten Kharkiv further north, and that incursion has been very disappointing if you're Russian, and largely successfully repulsed if you are Ukrainian. But what's developing in the north is a problem around the Oskil River, which the Russians have now crossed. They've got a bridgehead. They're now pushing south, and so Kupiansk is beginning to be threatened. And so you have another, town, city, that urban area that is increasingly vulnerable from multiple directions. And the Russians do not mind killing civilians and destroying civilian areas to basically inflict pain on the Ukrainians. And so there'll be another dilemma for the Ukrainians about the extent to which they invest in defense.
The Donbass has been at the center of Putin's machinations over Ukraine since 2014. Could you just give us the context for his political claims and geostrategic objectives in the region?
I'm in danger now of like wildly simplifying and failing to represent it, but broadly speaking, it is an extension of the parts of the country where you have the largest concentration of Russian speakers and a degree of affinity with Russia as a country, although we are still talking fundamentally about people who are overwhelmingly Ukrainian and saw themselves as Ukrainian. And, the separatist movement was and is small. And we get reporting from what comes out of, the temporarily occupied areas, as they're known, of pretty egregious abuses by the forces of the civilian population that remained. I think we've seen what happened in terms of parts of the east that were destroyed, But broadly speaking, this is the bit where the original insurrection that was sponsored by Russia started. These are the areas in and Crimea, which of course they, will claim is historically Russian and should never have been given to Ukraine, um, with the parts that they seized in the original assault in 2014. And essentially what they're trying to do is join up the geographic boundaries of the oblasts in order to make real on the ground what they did through, essentially forced referenda a couple of years ago, and basically say, well, these territories have now, seceded from Ukraine and they are Russia.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.